In this week's sermon, we are once again talking about God's love and faithfulness. And whereas last week we were explaining the concepts from Exodus 34, 6 and 7, this week we are exemplifying those concepts. And as we have done in the past, we're doing so from a story that may well have been very familiar to Moses and to the people that he led. We're going to be reading Genesis 50, verses 15 through 21. But we're really talking about the entire Joseph story. So here we are. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs that we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "These are the instructions that our father left with us before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and wrongs." You could translate one of those words crimes. That's how some translations do it. But this is what the NIV does. The sins and wrongs that they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When Joseph received their message, he wept. Then his brothers came and threw themselves down before him and said, "We are your slaves." But Joseph said, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You meant to harm me, but God meant it for good, to accomplish all that is being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and for your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Now, last week, we talked about the love and faithfulness of God. We tried to explain what those Hebrew words, chesed and amat, really mean. And we said that God's love and faithfulness are a quintessential part of his character. We also said that God is not sparing in dispensing his love and faithfulness. Rather, his love and faithfulness abound to those who need them. Now, in this week, what we want to do is we want to look for traces of God's love and faithfulness in the life of a just very real, very typical person, Joseph. And hopefully, as we see God's love and faithfulness in Joseph's life, we'll get better at seeing it in our own lives as well. So let's begin by kind of talking our way through the story of Joseph. And his story begins as an act of God's mercy. His mother, Rachel, was barren. That's a hard thing in any society, but it was especially difficult in the societies of the ancient Near East. And God looked upon Rachel's misery, so to speak, and had mercy on her and gave her a son. Now, Joseph was born into some slightly ambiguous status. He is, after all, the oldest son of his mother. And we'll talk in a moment about why that matters. But that's not, at least in the way things were ideally done, that's not the most important thing. And I say ideally in the sense of how people usually practiced things in the ancient Near East, not how we would think they ought to be done. So ideally, that doesn't matter as much as the fact that Joseph was, for a long time, his father's youngest son. And even after Benjamin was born, he's still his father's second youngest son. So he's his mother's oldest son, but his father's youngest. Hence the status ambiguity. But none of that really mattered because Joseph was favored by his father. And it seems he was also favored by God. Now, one of the really interesting things that our writer in Genesis does is he just kind of pulls you along into the story. Now, if you're paying attention and if you remember previous parts of the story, you get little breadcrumbs that he leaves along the way. But if you don't, you can kind of be left going, well, okay, what's really going on here? And this whole matter of Joseph being favored by God is one of those. You see, Joseph, as he starts to grow up, starts having these dreams. These dreams that seem to indicate that Joseph's brothers and even his parents are going to bow down to him, that they're going to be under his authority. Now, like a good annoying brother, Joseph doesn't do the smart thing and keep those dreams to himself. He tells his brothers about these dreams. More about that in just a second. He also tells his father and mother, and that didn't work out exactly the way he may have hoped, but Jacob did keep the matter in mind. Joseph's father. Now, in spite of some of these, challenges, Joseph's beginning, one might say, was a good one. The problem is that there were also complications, and those complications come right from the start. Joseph was born into a dysfunctional family system, and we won't get into all the ways that his family was dysfunctional here. There's actually quite a few of them. But we're going to get into some of them. And the main thing we want to talk about is Joseph's mother was not Jacob's only wife. Jacob has two wives, and they're sisters. By the way, one of the complications for Joseph is that his mother is the younger sister. But Rachel is the one, Joseph's mother, is the one that Jacob loved. But Leah, the older sister, she's the one that started cranking out kids. And that's the one that Jacob's society would have told him he's supposed to love. She has 6 sons and a daughter. Now, as you might imagine, there's a lot of sibling rivalry here. Indeed, the law will later forbid Israelites from taking a sister as a rival wife to her sister. Probably looking back on this whole experience and going, let's not do that again. Now, that rivalry gave Jacob a couple of extra wives, we'll call them, temporarily, because each of his real wives gave their slave to Jacob to be his wife. More properly speaking, his concubine. Now, the reason that we have to say it that way is because you can't have a slave and a free woman of the same status. But the Hebrew text often just refers to them as wives. And they each bear Jacob's sons. Now, this sounds like a mess, doesn't it? And it was. And don't you think for a minute that the kids don't all know about it. They all know why Joseph is the favorite. They all know, and Benjamin was Rachel's other son. They all know why he's the favorite. And with Benjamin, it's a little more understandable, I think, because Rachel died while giving birth to Benjamin. But for Joseph, his brothers resented that. They resented that he was their father's favorite. That's a complication for Joseph. But things are only going to get more complicated because you see, once Joseph kind of gets pretty grown up, his father starts sending him out to check on the other brothers. You see, Jacob's family, they were shepherds. And Jacob might be in one place, but his sons might be shepherding the flocks in another place. So Jacob sends out his son Joseph to check on his brothers, and Joseph brings back a bad report about the low status brothers. That is, the sons of the concubines. Now you might be thinking to yourself, oh, this Joseph, that's pretty smart politics, right? You're thinking, don't bring back a bad report about the full brothers here, the brothers of the sister, the brothers of a wife. Bring back a bad report about the brothers of a concubine. Makes sense, right? The problem is that we find, psychologically, that people whose status is under threat tend to react more strongly when that status is questioned. And that seems to have been what happened here. These brothers get even more angry at Joseph, and they serve as a cancer. But of course, Joseph's other brothers have got their own problems. It's weird. You've got these two very strange stories that are just kind of dropped down into the middle of the Joseph cycle. And you're like, why are these here? But I think that the story of Judah and his daughter-in-law, and the story of, especially the story of Reuben sleeping with his father's concubine, serve to help us understand how messed up this family is, and how fractured and confused things could be. Now, it's in the midst of all of those complications that something very important happens. Jacob again sends his son, Joseph, to check on his brothers. But Jacob has no idea the long and winding road upon which he is sending his son. You probably remember at least a big part of this story. Joseph goes out to check on his brothers. He finally finds them. And when they see him coming, some of his brothers are just like, hey, let's just kill this guy. Let's just get him out of our hair. Let's just kill him. But the oldest brother, Reuben, the one who messed up by sleeping with his father's concubine, says, no, that's not what we're going to do. We are not going to kill this guy. We're just not going to do that. I'll tell you what. You guys just beat him up and throw him in that cistern over there. We'll figure out what to do with him later. And it's clear that Reuben has in mind to send Joseph back to his father unharmed. So they listen to their older brother, and perhaps Reuben intervenes on Joseph's behalf because of his sense of obligation to his father. He knows he's messed up, but for whatever reason, he intervenes on Joseph's behalf, and they do what Reuben suggests. They beat him up, throw him in a cistern, rough him up a little bit, do what brothers do to brothers. Then Reuben, he probably thinks that, well, okay, that's settled, we're all good. He wanders off and does whatever it is that he does. The text doesn't tell us. Well, then the brothers get the idea, hey, I know what we'll do. If we kill him, we don't gain anything out of this. Let's sell him. And that's what they do. They sell him to some traders. Those traders take him down to Egypt. And to make a long story short, Joseph gets sold into the house of a major Egyptian official, which sounds like a good thing, except that then he's falsely accused of a crime while he's in that house and ends up in Pharaoh's prison. And Joseph would have languished there for who knows how long, if not for one thing. God has given him the ability to interpret dreams. And through a fantastic turn of events that itself still took years to unfold, Joseph comes out on top. He almost literally goes from the outhouse to the penthouse. He interprets an important dream for Pharaoh, and Pharaoh decides, you know what? I need to make you my prime minister. And all of a sudden, Joseph is the most powerful man, perhaps outside of Pharaoh himself, in all of Egypt, which is the most powerful, or one of the most powerful countries in the known world. And in fact, that's how Joseph's brothers encounter him. You should go back and read Genesis 45, verses 1 through 15. It's a powerful, powerful story. Joseph's brothers come down to Egypt because they're looking for food, because there's a famine all over the ancient Near Eastern world. And they need food. And Joseph toys with them a little bit. He plays with them a little bit. But in Genesis 45, he reveals himself to them. And they just go, oh, bleep. Sorry, I don't know any Hebrew cuss words, but I'm sure they were thinking them. They were certain that they were dead. But Joseph basically tells them, don't worry about it. We got other fish to fry, and this was all God's doing anyway. And he sends his brothers back to Canaan in peace and says, bring my father down here, because there's more famine to come. Our text, by the way, that we read this day, it's from the end of this story. Joseph's not quite dead yet, of course. Well, actually, Joseph's not quite dead yet. That's right. But Jacob has just died, and this is long after the famine is over. And they're still worried. And they should be. But they don't have to be. Now, there's so much really neat stuff that we could learn from Joseph, okay? But really, we're just telling Joseph's story so that we can ask ourselves, all right, how do we see God at work in Joseph's story? How do we see God manifesting his love and his faithfulness? And I think there are 4 things that we can learn about how God manifests his love and faithfulness in the Joseph story. And the first thing that I think we need to notice is that this is all part of God's plan. God has been at work, sort of arranging the circumstances for a long time. In fact, God told Joseph's great-grandfather that all of this stuff, that this going down to Egypt thing, that this was going to happen. Now, of course, he doesn't tell Abraham all of the details. You see here in Genesis 15, 13, and 14 what exactly God told Abraham. But Joseph's life is part of this story. Joseph's life is part of God's plan. Now, God did all this. God arranged for all of this, yes, to deliver Jacob and his descendants from the famine. But one of the things that we see in God's words to Abraham is that the subsequent suffering that Jacob's descendants would experience in Egypt was also part of God's plan. That can be a difficult word, but it's one that I think is important for us to consider as we think about how God might be at work in our own lives. Secondly, we need to recognize that the characters in the story are oftentimes unaware of how God is at work, of how God's love and faithfulness are manifesting themselves. Jacob didn't know, or at least didn't remember, that his path would find its way to Egypt. Joseph probably didn't know that his own journey would go through so many dark places before his dreams came true. And Joseph's brothers certainly were unaware of how God was already at work on their behalf as they sold Joseph into slavery. But that doesn't mean that God isn't at work. He is. And indeed, God's work, God's activity, is hidden in the details of Joseph's story. Now, it may not always work out this way for us, but for Joseph, we see it in three very specific ways. For one thing, God blesses Joseph's work. It doesn't matter where Joseph is, God blesses his work. For another thing, God seems to just keep putting people in Joseph's life who favor him, who show him grace, who show him kindness, who see something in him and put him to work doing important things. And then, of course, third, Joseph keeps running across people who can help him. You know, by the way, and I think this is a really important point to consider, because sometimes we think, oh, well, you know, surely God could have done this a different way. And maybe he intended to. But Jesus is quite clear that not everything that happens to us is God's will. So think about it this way. Joseph was in Potiphar's house. If not for the intervention of Potiphar's wife, falsely accusing Joseph of a crime, he might have had an easier path to influence with Pharaoh. But that's not what happened. And we don't know why. And it's not really for us to know why. All we need to know is Joseph was in Potiphar's house. Potiphar could have been a really big benefit to Joseph, but that's not what happened. But then Joseph ends up in prison, and there's this jailer who believes in Joseph and who helps Joseph. And it's possibly because of that right there, because of the trust that the jailer put in Joseph, that he encountered these officials of Pharaoh, one of whom would eventually remember Joseph and mention Joseph. And then the final point that we want to make is that God's work on Joseph's behalf, God's love and faithfulness for Joseph, were not simply for Joseph. They may have started with him, but they radiated out from Joseph to his father's entire family, to their descendants, to all the people of Egypt, and even to the whole known world. So what does all of this mean for us as we try to find God's love and faithfulness in our own lives? Well, I think our first lesson is that a lot of times we won't be able to see what God is up to until we're looking back on it, until it's done. And sometimes we still won't see it. But a lot of times it really is true that we don't see what God is doing until he actually does it. The second thing that I think we should remember is that God's activity is often hidden in the details of our story, in circumstances and relationships that might seem accidental, but that are really the handiwork of God. Third, I think we need to remember that struggles and setbacks, and even suffering, but suffering, struggles, setbacks, that's just going to be part of the journey. It just is. I don't know about you, but I don't like failure. I hate to fail. I don't like suffering either. And as we've already noted, those things are not always God's will. But he does use them to accomplish his purposes. God knows what he's doing. He knows the setbacks that we will experience. And he knows how he wants to fit us into his purposes. But again, the problem is when we're experiencing that suffering and those setbacks, it's hard to see. All of this is just hard to see. And that's why, finally, faith is so important. And specifically, faith in God's love and God's faithfulness. I will be honest with you, there have been times in my life when I did not trust the love and faithfulness of God. Those were hard times. They really were. And I think, the suffering and the setbacks, those were hard, okay? Those were hard, and sometimes that's what I focused on. But I think what was really hard was just not believing that God loved me, not believing that God was faithful to me, not believing that I could trust God. That was the hardest part. In those moments, when we're just not putting all the puzzle pieces together, when we're just not seeing what it is that God is doing, when we've got that sense that, well, in fact, maybe I'm on the wrong track, that's when we have to trust God's love and faithfulness. It's not that we're trusting our ability to understand what God is doing. No. It's not that we're trusting in a specific articulation of God's plan. No. Because a lot of times that just came out of our own head anyway. No. We're trusting God. We're trusting his character. We're trusting his goodness. And that's what I want to encourage you to do today, as you reflect upon how God's love and faithfulness have been manifest in your own journey with him.